On December 7, 1941, Admiral William Halsey stood on the bridge of USS Enterprise 200 miles west of Oahu, watching his pilots return from a routine patrol mission. Some were trailing smoke, others had bullet holes in their wings. The radio reports made no sense. Pearl Harbor was under attack. Japanese aircraft everywhere, battleships burning. Halsey ordered flank speed toward Hawaii, preparing to launch a counterattack, already knowing he was too late. When Enterprise finally reached Pearl Harbor the next morning, and Halsey saw the destruction through his binoculars, he understood immediately that the 8 battleships smoldering in the harbor no longer mattered. The Pacific Fleet's offensive capability now rested entirely on the 3 aircraft carriers that had escaped destruction by pure chance. And for the next 6 months, through the darkest period of the Pacific War, one of those carriers, Enterprise, would carry the weight of American defenses virtually alone. This is the story of how a single warship and her 2,000 crew members became America's only offensive weapon in the Pacific, conducting raids against Japanese bases when logic said they should retreat, fighting battles that couldn't be won but had to be fought anyway, and holding the line through sheer determination during the months when losing Enterprise would have meant losing the entire Pacific theater. The morning after Pearl Harbor, Enterprise entered the harbor through the narrow channel, past capsized battleships and burning oil that still covered the water. Her crew lined the rails in silence, staring at the destruction. Arizona lay on the bottom, with over 1,000 men still entombed inside. Oklahoma had rolled completely over. West Virginia had settled in the mud. California was sinking. Tennessee and Maryland were damaged. Pennsylvania sat in dry dock, hit but repairable. Nevada, the only battleship to get underway during the attack, had run aground to prevent sinking in the channel. The backbone of American naval power in the Pacific, the battle line that war plans assumed would decide any conflict with Japan, was gone. 3 aircraft carriers had survived. Enterprise had been delivering Marine fighters to Wake Island and was returning when the attack occurred. Lexington was ferrying aircraft to Midway Island. Saratoga was on the west coast. That was everything. 3 carriers to defend an ocean that stretched 10,000 miles from California to Australia, to protect Hawaii, to support the Philippines, to contest Japanese expansion across the Pacific. The strategic mathematics were brutal. Japan had 6 fleet carriers that had just demonstrated devastating effectiveness at Pearl Harbor, plus several light carriers. They had overwhelming numerical superiority, the initiative and momentum. American carriers would have to operate alone, taking risks no peacetime planner would accept, because there was no alternative. Admiral Chester Nimitz assumed command of the Pacific Fleet on Christmas Day 1941 in a ceremony at the submarine base, the only facility at Pearl Harbor that could accommodate the event. Every other venue was destroyed or unusable. Nimitz's first priority was assessing what forces remained operational. The battleship count was simple 0. Cruisers and destroyers had survived largely intact, but without battleships or carriers to escort, their usefulness was limited. Submarines offered the only other offensive capability, though peacetime torpedo development had been criminally negligent, leaving boats equipped with defective weapons that often failed to explode. The carrier force was all that remained. Enterprise became the centerpiece of Nimitz's strategy by default. She was the only carrier immediately available in Hawaiian waters. Lexington was still returning from Midway. Saratoga would arrive soon, but needed time to organize her air group and work up to operational readiness. Enterprise, commanded by Captain George Murray with Halsey as task force commander, was ready to fight. She had escaped Pearl Harbor. By luck, bad weather had delayed her return by 1 day. But that luck put her in position to conduct the first American offensive operations of the war. The crew understood what the burned-out hulks in Pearl Harbor meant for them. There would be no relief, no rotation back to the States, no stand-down periods for maintenance and rest. Enterprise would deploy raid Japanese bases, return to refuel and rearm, and deploy again immediately. The ship's tempo would exceed any peacetime operating schedule. Men would go months without shore leave. The ship would operate under constant threat of submarine attack, air attack, or surface engagement against superior forces. And if Enterprise went down, there was nothing behind her. The Pacific defense would collapse. Halsey wasted no time on defensive operations. In early January 1942, Enterprise led a task force toward the Marshall and Gilbert Islands Japanese-held territories in the Central Pacific. The mission was a raid, not an invasion. Launch aircraft, hit whatever targets could be found, and get out before Japanese counterattacks arrived. The strategic purpose was psychological rather than tactical. Demonstrate that America could strike back, that Japanese bases weren't invulnerable, that the war wasn't over despite Pearl Harbor's devastation. On February 1, 1942, Enterprise aircraft struck Kwajalein Watcher and Maloelap atolls. They sank several small warships, destroyed aircraft on the ground, and bombed shore facilities. The damage inflicted was minimal by strategic standards, nothing that would affect Japan's offensive capability. But the effect on American morale was substantial. Newspaper headlines celebrated the raids. The American public, starved for good news after weeks of defeats across the Pacific, seized on these small victories as proof that resistance was possible. For Enterprise's crew, the raid proved something different. They could penetrate Japanese-held waters, strike targets, and escape without catastrophic losses. The Japanese air response was uncoordinated and ineffective. Their fighters were caught on the ground. Their anti-aircraft fire was inaccurate. The vulnerability of island bases to carrier raids became apparent. More importantly, the raid demonstrated that aggressive action was survivable. Halsey's instinct was to attack, and the Marshall-Gilbert's raid validated that approach. 2 weeks later, Enterprise struck Wake Island, hitting Japanese positions that had captured the island from American forces in late December. Again, the material damage was limited, but the raid served notice that no Japanese base within carrier range was safe. The psychological warfare worked both ways. These raids forced Japanese commanders to divert resources to defensive preparations, to maintain stronger garrisons at rear area bases, to expect attacks that might never come. But Enterprise couldn't be everywhere. Through January and February 1942, Japanese forces swept through the Southwest Pacific with devastating efficiency. The Philippines were collapsing despite desperate resistance. Singapore fell on February 15th, shocking the British Empire and opening the Indian Ocean to Japanese operations. The Dutch East Indies were being overrun, cutting off vital oil supplies the Allies desperately needed. Japanese carriers rampaged through the region, supporting invasion forces and sinking Allied ships that tried to interfere. Admiral Ernest King, Commander-in-Chief of the US fleet, ordered Nimitz to contest Japanese expansion despite impossible odds. The political pressure was enormous. Australia feared invasion and demanded American naval support. General Douglas MacArthur, commanding Allied forces in the Southwest Pacific, insisted carriers were essential to prevent complete Japanese domination. Nimitz had to balance these demands against the reality that losing his few carriers would end any possibility of future offensive operations. Enterprise deployed again in late February, this time toward the Southwest Pacific to raid Japanese bases supporting their New Guinea operations. The mission required operating in confined waters near enemy airbases, exactly the scenario carriers were supposed to avoid. But there was no choice. If Japanese forces consolidated their positions in New Guinea and the Solomons, Australia would be isolated and potentially invaded. Enterprise had to disrupt these operations somehow. On March 10, 1942, Enterprise aircraft struck Rabaul, the major Japanese base in New Britain. The raid achieved surprise, catching Japanese aircraft on the ground and sinking merchant shipping in the harbour. But the counterattack demonstrated how exposed Enterprise was operating alone in enemy-controlled waters. Japanese bombers from Rabaul pursued the task force for hours. Enterprise's combat air patrol shot down several attackers, but bombs landed close enough to spray the flight deck with shrapnel. One near miss lifted the ship's stern partially out of the water. Damage was minimal, but the message was clear: operating alone. This deep in Japanese-controlled waters was approaching suicide. Halsey withdrew and Enterprise returned to Pearl Harbor for urgent repairs and resupply. The ship had been at sea almost continuously since Pearl Harbor, conducting operations that pushed the crew to exhaustion. Maintenance that should have taken weeks in port had been deferred. Machinery was breaking down from overuse. The ship needed rest. The crew needed rest. But rest was a luxury the strategic situation didn't permit. While Enterprise was in port, Lexington and Yorktown operated in the Coral Sea, attempting to block Japanese advances toward Port Moresby and Australia. The Battle of the Coral Sea in early May resulted in Lexington sinking after Japanese torpedo and bomb hits caused uncontrollable fires. Yorktown survived, but took damage that required dry dock repairs. Saratoga had been torpedoed by a submarine in January and was still under repair on the west coast. Within 5 months of Pearl Harbor, the Pacific Fleet had gone from 3 operational carriers to 1. Enterprise was alone again. The loss of Lexington hit Enterprise's crew hard. They'd known Lady Lex's crew served with them, shared the impossible burden of defending the entire Pacific with inadequate forces. Now those men were gone, the ship was gone, and Enterprise carried even more weight than before. There was no hiding the strategic reality. If Enterprise went down, the Pacific defense would rely on Hornet, newly arrived, but untested in combat, and whatever timeline repairs on Yorktown and Saratoga followed. Then intelligence intercepts revealed Japanese plans for an operation against Midway Island scheduled for early June. The intercepts were fragmentary and partially encoded, but American cryptanalysts concluded that Japan intended to capture Midway as a stepping stone toward Hawaii, and to draw out the remnants of the Pacific Fleet for a decisive battle. This was the confrontation Nimitz had been avoiding, a major engagement where Japanese numerical superiority would be overwhelming. But avoiding battle meant ceding Midway, which meant giving Japan a base only 1,000 miles from Hawaii. The decision was made: Enterprise would fight. The Battle of Midway on June 4, 1942, represented everything Enterprise had been preparing for since Pearl Harbor. The Japanese committed 4 fleet carriers, Akagi Kaga Soryu and Hiryu, plus the light carriers Ryujo and Junyo, in support roles, along with battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and submarines. Nimitz had Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown rushed out of dry dock before repairs were complete. The Americans were outnumbered, but held one critical advantage: they knew the Japanese were coming. Enterprise's role at Midway was decisive. Her dive bombers, led by Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, found the Japanese carriers at the critical moment when their flight decks were crowded with aircraft being refueled and rearmed. McCluskey's squadrons dove through anti-aircraft fire and struck Akagi and Kaga within minutes, leaving both carriers burning and doomed. Yorktown's aircraft hit Soryu simultaneously. 3 Japanese carriers eliminated in 5 minutes, the most devastating carrier strike in naval history. But the battle wasn't over. Hiryu survived the initial attack and launched strikes against the American carriers. Yorktown took hits that left her dead in the water. Japanese pilots reported sinking an American carrier, which was accurate, and assumed they'd evened the odds. They hadn't accounted for Enterprise and Hornet still being operational. Enterprise launched a second strike against Hiryu in the afternoon, hitting the Japanese carrier with fatal damage. By sunset on June 4th, all 4 Japanese fleet carriers were sinking or sunk. The Battle of Midway shifted the Pacific War's balance permanently. Enterprise's contribution went beyond her aircraft's tactical success. For 6 months, she had been the Pacific Fleet's primary offensive weapon, conducting raids that demonstrated American resilience, forcing Japanese dispersal of defensive resources, and keeping alive the possibility of eventual counteroffensive. The psychological impact of Enterprise's survival and effectiveness influenced Japanese strategic planning. They knew at least one American carrier remained operational and dangerous. They couldn't ignore the threat. They had to allocate forces to defensive preparations that might otherwise have supported offensive operations. The months between Pearl Harbor and Midway represented the most desperate period of America's Pacific War. Defeat followed defeat. The Philippines fell despite heroic resistance. Singapore's surrender shocked the world. The Dutch East Indies were lost. Japanese forces reached the approaches to Australia and India. At every point where resistance seemed possible, inadequate forces, an overwhelming Japanese superiority doomed defensive efforts. Except at sea, where Enterprise and her sister carriers fought a delaying action that prevented complete collapse. The cost to Enterprise's crew was measurable in exhaustion and casualties, but impossible to quantify in stress and psychological burden. Pilots flew mission after mission, knowing each could be their last, watching friends die in burning aircraft or disappear over the ocean. Flight deck crews worked 18-hour shifts handling aircraft and ordnance under combat conditions where one mistake meant explosions and death. Engineering crews kept machinery running through problems that would normally require shipyard repairs. Everyone aboard understood that if Enterprise went down, they were going down with her, and their deaths would likely doom the Pacific defense. The ship herself showed the strain. By June 1942, Enterprise needed major maintenance that would take months in peacetime. Boilers required overhaul. Electrical systems were failing. Aircraft elevators had mechanical problems. The flight deck had taken shrapnel damage from near misses. Saltwater corrosion affected equipment throughout the ship. But there was no time for systematic repairs. Damage control parties fixed what broke, replaced what failed, and kept the ship operational through improvisation and determination. Admiral Halsey's health collapsed under the stress. He developed a severe case of dermatitis that left him hospitalized and unable to command at Midway. His replacement, Admiral Raymond Spruance, adopted a more cautious tactical approach, but maintained the aggressive, strategic posture. Enterprise remained the tip of the spear, the ship that carried America's Pacific defense when no other forces were available. The statistics from those 6 months tell part of the story. Enterprise steamed over 100,000 miles, launched thousands of sorties, participated in every major American offensive operation in the Pacific, and survived multiple near misses and one direct hit. Her aircraft sank or damaged dozens of enemy ships, destroyed hundreds of aircraft, and struck targets across 5,000 miles of ocean. Her combat operations tempo exceeded anything peacetime planners considered sustainable, but statistics don't capture the psychological weight of being the last line of defense. Enterprise's crew knew they were operating without backup, that losing the ship meant strategic catastrophe, that their survival mattered not just personally, but nationally. This knowledge affected every decision, every action, every mission. Pilots pushed themselves beyond reasonable limits. Maintenance crews performed miracles of improvisation. Everyone aboard accepted risk levels that made peacetime safety regulations seem absurd. The moment at Midway, when Enterprise's dive bombers destroyed the Japanese carriers, validated everything the ship had endured since Pearl Harbor. The raids on Japanese bases, the narrow escapes, the exhausting deployments, the lost friends, all of it had been building toward this. Enterprise had held the line long enough for reinforcements to arrive, for strategy to develop, for American industrial production to begin replacing losses. The 6 months of desperate defensive fighting had bought time for eventual victory. After Midway, Enterprise continued fighting through campaigns at Guadalcanal, Santa Cruz, the Solomons, and eventually the great carrier battles of 1944 to 45. She survived the war as the most decorated ship in American naval history, participating in every major Pacific campaign. But those first 6 months, when she stood virtually alone against the Japanese onslaught, remained her defining period. Everything else was fighting toward inevitable victory. Those months after Pearl Harbor were fighting for survival. The crew members who served aboard Enterprise during that period carried the experience for the rest of their lives. They'd been part of something unique in naval history, a single ship that bore responsibility for an entire ocean's defense. They'd operated at the edge of sustainability, taking risks. No peacetime commander would accept achieving results that shouldn't have been possible with available resources. They'd held the line when the line was everything. When Enterprise finally returned to Pearl Harbor after Midway, her crew saw that the harbor had changed. Salvage crews had raised some of the sunken battleships. Repair work was progressing on damaged vessels. New construction was arriving from the States. The fleet was rebuilding. The desperate months when Enterprise carried the Pacific Fleet's entire offensive capability were ending. Reinforcements were coming. The strategic situation remained dangerous, but it was no longer hopeless. Standing on Enterprise's flight deck, looking across the harbour at the rising battleships and arriving carriers, her crew understood what they'd accomplished. They'd bought time. Time for America's industrial base to mobilise. Time for new ships to be built. Time for pilots to be trained. Time for strategy to evolve. Time for the Pacific Fleet to transform from a shattered force surviving on improvisation into the most powerful naval armada ever assembled. But in those first 6 months after Pearl Harbor, when none of that existed yet, when defeat seemed possible, and even likely, when the entire Pacific defense rested on a single carrier, operating at the edge of sustainability, Enterprise had been enough. Barely enough. Almost not enough. But enough. That's the story of those desperate months. Not a story of inevitable triumph or superior resources, but a story of one ship and 2,000 crew members holding the line when there was nothing behind them, fighting battles they couldn't afford to lose, with resources they couldn't afford to sacrifice, surviving through skill and luck and determination when survival meant everything. The Enterprise earned 20 battle stars during World War II, more than any other American warship. She participated in nearly every major Pacific campaign from Pearl Harbor through Okinawa. She took horrific damage and kept fighting. She launched thousands of strikes that destroyed hundreds of enemy ships and aircraft. She earned nicknames like the Big E and the Fighting Lady that captured her reputation. But her greatest achievement wasn't measured in battle stars or enemy ships sunk. It was measured in time, 6 months of desperate fighting that held back Japanese expansion long enough for America to organize a counteroffensive. 6 months when Enterprise and her crew carried the weight of the Pacific Fleet because there was no one else to carry it. 6 months when losing the ship would have meant losing the war. Admiral Halsey once said of Enterprise, "She was the one ship that turned the tide." He meant Midway specifically, but the quote applies equally to those months between December 1941 and June 1942. Enterprise didn't turn the tide alone. Yorktown, Lexington, Hornet and Saratoga all contributed when available, but Enterprise was there continuously operating when others were damaged or absent, conducting the raids and fighting the battles that had to be fought because there was no alternative. The ship that accidentally missed the Pearl Harbor attack through bad weather became the ship that saved the Pacific Fleet through good fortune and exceptional performance. The randomness of that survival, a one-day delay in return from Wake Island, meant the difference between having a carrier force after Pearl Harbor and having no carriers at all. Sometimes history pivots on weather patterns and scheduling coincidences. But what Enterprise's crew did with that accidental survival was anything but random. They made deliberate choices to take extraordinary risks, to operate beyond sustainable limits, to fight battles where defeat meant catastrophe. They chose to be aggressive when caution would have been justified. They chose to hold the line when withdrawal would have been understandable. They chose to carry the weight of Pacific defense because someone had to, and Enterprise was the only ship available. That choice, repeated every day through those desperate months, made the difference between survival and collapse. Enterprise alone in the Pacific carrying the fight when there was nothing else holding the line until reinforcements arrived. The single most important ship in American naval history during the period when her survival mattered most.